Good morning, good afternoon, and this is the first ever episode of the Zygmunt Reichenbach Show with our great host, the ever ready Grant Henry, coming out of Tennessee. How's life been for you, buddy?
Doing well, buddy. How you doing?
I'm all right, man. Just looking forward to kicking this off and being able to deep dive into some of the topics that have been overlooked or perhaps ill considered in the traditional news media. Make sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to ZygmuntDReichenbach.com for our daily newsletter, or forgive me, our Monday through Friday newsletter. So that way you can be in on the discussion of the stories that the news is not discussing. And then also make sure, if you do want to donate to support our show to reach an even larger audience, go to patreon.com/Z Reichenbach to donate. One of the main topics we want to discuss here today is we have four primary ones. We want to talk about restraining democracy and how the best parts of democracy aren't possible without restraint. We'll transition from there into a discussion of critical race theory. Is it a religion? Is it a religion of permanent anger? Talk about political cliches as we venture into the primary season. And then we will get to the big vaccine mandate win that was not. It's not unequivocally a win. In fact, you still have healthcare workers that have to deal with a vaccine mandate. But before I get to that, I want to introduce you, Mr. Grant Henry. I did check in with you a little bit, Grant. Go ahead and give us an update about you.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Grant Henry. Zig and I have done a few things in the past together, whether it's something related to his day job or whether it's something related to more what we're doing now, bringing people up to speed on sort of world fairs, world topics, and just politics in general. I like this format we have going on right now. Sort of a podcast style interview type thing. And especially what you've started here. If you don't know any of this stuff that Zig's been writing recently, literally he's just firstlastname.com. Some of the stuff you've been putting out, buddy, has been great. I've been subscribed since day one myself. It goes right to my email every single time. I love all of it. And I love this first topic as well. Republican restraint on democracy. Looking forward to all this, man.
Yeah. No, it's a great topic to discuss, mainly because we hear so many politicians advocate for democracy, and we have more and more people continue to think and believe that democracy in and of itself is a unequivocally good thing. But I don't think that if you have unlimited or a lack of restraint on democracy, then you have anything at all. I think you have something closer to impending tyranny. And as I mentioned in my article, without checks and balances, the majority always gets their way. And it seems like when they do, like poorly parented children, those citizens become self-righteous, lazy, and disinterested. And over time, I think what you see is a politically entrenched underclass, people who are permanently dependent on the government because they've always gotten all the things that they've wanted. It seems like the last 100 years, with the expansion of the welfare state, the New Deal programs, you've only seen quote unquote democracy expand, but you don't have the best elements of democracy, the participation, the citizen input, and the camaraderie preserved, right?
Yeah, it seems like so whenever anybody asks a question in Tennessee or any other southern state for that matter, or really any state in America for that matter, why our cities are so blue and the rural counties around them are so red, it's a little bit of what you're talking about right now, Zig, right? That the people inside these cities become so reliant upon the government system itself, whether they realize it or not. Whether, basically telling you how you're going to get to work, when you're going to get to work, where you can take your dog to do the dog's business and everything in between. You get what I'm saying? They become so reliant upon the system itself that you just end up perpetuating that system. Because God forbid you have to go backwards one step because you don't know what that looks like. The fear of the unknown is possibly the greatest fear that some people have sometimes. And I think you're really touching on a notion here that even when we've heard some of my friends on the other side of the political aisle over the last couple of years say that we need to get rid of, say, I don't know, man, whether it's the electoral college, the general public, the general the process we have right now to enshrine in our republic itself, right? To get rid of that and sort of replace it in favor of, say, a popular vote for president. This notion itself is always put under the guise of protecting the little guy, of protecting the minority. And what they don't realize is the republic structure itself, the one that we're currently operating under, that that is what's protecting the minority, right? We're just using those terms, I think, in distinctly different ways, but it's an interesting thing to juxtapose.
I think when you have the expansion of the welfare state, you actually create a two-tiered society where you have the wealthy elites preach things that they probably don't believe, and then you have that underclass that's dependent on these ever ballooning programs. And I think when people start to theorize about democracy, which apparently hasn't been well theorized, because the term in and of itself means people power, right? Where there can be no people power in a entitlement state, because an ever expanding number of people become more and more dependent on government in and of itself. That's not people power. And moreover, the democratic element of society, again, without those checks and balances, will not be preserved. Where actually you see an ever-growing mob in social media, in politics, and how people expect to do things. And I don't think a mob in and of itself is democratic. I don't think that creates any kind of equality. It certainly doesn't allow people to participate much. If they're a part of a mob, they're really not going to be able to participate in any meaningful way that's different than what the rest of the mob is doing, and they're not going to be able to put their own unique input into things. And I think what anybody should be concerned is that without the Republican restraint on democracy, democracy itself cannot exist. And this restraint, this Republican restraint, is gradually and clearly being whittled away. You have the passage of the 17th Amendment that crippled the Senate and made it more responsive to mob tyranny and majoritarian politicking. I think we've seen that with the lobbying of Sinema in the restroom that she was using while she was teaching, or the harassment of Joe Manchin while he's on the yacht. That's more or less turned that whole institution into a second form of the House. Likewise, presidents themselves have ignored their duty to serve the states with their demagogic insertions into public discourse. You don't hear the president advocating for the states. You only hear presidents talk about their need to help the people, which is a descent into mob tyranny. Grant, what are your thoughts about the president being less of a statesman for the individual states and more of a spokesman for this majoritarian mob politics?
Yeah, so someone's going to have to, Zig, you might be able to tell me, or rather remind me of which Federalist paper this is pulling from. But what was it, Hamilton or whoever said that the Supreme Court is meant to be the least feared branch of government because it has neither the power of the purse nor the sword. Okay, and I think obviously the implication there is that all they're going to do is interpret the law for us. So the Congress itself should be one of the most feared branches, but it seems like Congress has been able to, and this gets a little bit into some of the topics we're about to touch on here in a minute, but Congress has been able to delegate so much of its authority to other areas of government that it doesn't do much of anything anymore. Like, it passes some bills to spend a lot of money, and that's about it. And going back to what you said a second ago when it pertains to the 17th Amendment, it brings up this idea that, Zig, this has been a slow process, okay? Much like anything in American history, this has been a slow burn. We might use the analogy, if you will, of, if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will hop out immediately, as so is the American populace. If you immediately change something, we will try and hop out and recognize. But if you put us in that pot of boiling water, much like the frog, and you slowly turn that temperature up over time, it will sit there until it boils to death. We are boiling to death in America right now. And removing the 17th Amendment was one of those initial processes that did it. And it's not some innocuous thing that we should just gloss over. I mean, the initial analogy as it was presented to me is that America itself had this sort of triangle premise going on, okay, where you had sort of the voice of the people, that was the House of Representatives. You had the federal idea itself, federalisms, call it, I don't know, any one of the three branches of government up there we're talking about now, and the voice of the state. The states, they had a voice at some point. That was the state legislature electing our federal senators. Okay, so you had the voice of the people, the voice of the state, and the federal government itself. It was meant to be yet another threefold version of a checks and balances process. And once you got rid, via the 17th Amendment, Once you got rid of the voice of the state through the legislature itself, now all of a sudden it just became the federal government versus the people. And it removed one more peg in this system that Zig is talking about that was originally designed to prop up a representative republic. At every step along the way, you had some system of checks and balances so that, societal change happened properly over a long period of time. Now it's as quick as possible and it's mob rule. And if that 51% tells you that something's going to happen, it's going to happen. If not by way of a piece of legislation, they're just going to shove it through the court system right now. So back to your original question, Zig. What do I think of it? Where are we at right now? It has almost gotten to the point where Congress, the body that is supposed to be doing all of the legislating, is doing none of that at all. It seems like everything is happening through either executive order or through some type of court ordeal. I mean, even the OSHA story we're about to get to, that's the Supreme Court saving Republicans yet again. It's not the way to do it. I'll be quiet here now, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And you brought up a point that I didn't fully consider, or I didn't even mention in this article at zigmundyreichenbach.com/Republican restraint. But what I didn't mention was even how susceptible the courts themselves have been to majoritarian lobbying, right? Where I think under the original Obamacare decision, it was alleged that John Roberts changed his mind because of the mob lobbying him to do so. Right. So not even the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be distanced because of their undefined terms of service, even they are not able to fully deter the majoritarian politicking that's going on, to where if that continues over time, we're not going to have anybody be able to participate in society in any meaningful way. Because once we get these quote unquote democratic reforms, we typically get a democratic spokesman in the form of Chairman Xi or the other famous dictators of the past, where they preach the people's gospel, but are they really serving the people? Can the people express themselves, participate in elections? No, not really. So I think it would be useful if people, when they're thinking about democracy, if they actually thought about how to preserve the best elements of democratic society without going into some kind of excessive thinking. I think one of the biggest problems here is that you have people that take that theorizing too far and say, well, everything has to be for the people. Everything has to be for the people. Well, if you say that long enough, you'll form a mob, and you won't have people who view themselves as individuals. And it just seems like our republic is destined to reach the same pathetic fate of all these other places that have focused on quote unquote democracy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think moving on to this next topic, if you're ready, Zig, honestly, this idea of critical race theory, or what you call critical rage theory, I think is a philosophy that's being imparted upon us, at least in Tennessee at the K-12 level, and certainly up to the collegiate level. And the collegiate level is a totally different story. But that type of ideology, man, is yet one more thing that is I don't know, trying to do away with some of the fabric of what this country was founded on. Yeah. I mean, it's trying to do away with a lot of what we just ended up discussing: equal representation, the idea of representative republic, the idea that a mob rule democracy is what we've been told. It's two sheeps and a wolf voting on what's for lunch. We know who's going to win that every single time. That is mob rule. That is straight, pure, outright democracy. And I don't know, man. Again, I'm not sure if you're ready to move to this next topic, but I think it's a theory, or it's a topic that's being pushed in schools right now that is getting at the heart of a lot of this stuff.
I think there's a lot more interesting things that can be said about critical race theory than what's really being said by most people now. I mean, it seems like one is that it's a something of a religion where we are in a permanently fallen state, that is where disparity is equivalent to sin and fairness is equivalent to God, and only perfect utopian fairness can redeem us from our natural state. And I think that's interesting to consider from a number of different angles, some which are mentioned in the article and some which aren't. But if we're talking about the separation of church and state, and this is a religion, then what's happened is you've had people take out God from schools and pledging the allegiance to the flag and reading their Bibles, to now converting them from that religion to this new one where you have to feel guilty about hidden structures of oppression and power and dominance and control in a way that's no different from the notion of original sin, right? In fact, you even have Obama himself say something to the effect that white privilege is original sin. That's what Obama said in his speech. Now, how you can say that's religious, I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know if somebody's watching right now that has never looked into even what the tenets of critical race theory might be. I know in Tennessee in particular, they just passed a bill last year that tried to do something to say outlaw it from schools. And I don't even know if that's the proper solution, honestly, to try and fight against it legislatively as much as it's being allowed legislatively. I'm not even sure. Maybe the proper solution is just to get your kids out of public school and send them to a private school and take more control over the curriculum. Maybe that's the actual long-term answer. But look, I'm reading directly from the University of Tennessee's website. Indulge me for 2 minutes here, if you will. I'll break down what they claim to be the 5 central tenets. I hope this lends some type of credence to what Zig is saying, that critical race theory, in some sense, maybe better be looked at as a version of a religion. Okay, so here they say, tenet 1, centrality of race and racism in society. CRT asserts that racism is a central component of American life. Racism is a central component of American life. Number 2, they say challenge the dominant ideology. CRT challenges the claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, meritocracy in society. How do you challenge objectivity? We could do an entire show on the notion of challenging objectivity and the oxymoron that is the challenge of objectivity. You get what I'm saying? It's axiomatic. Objectivity it speaks for itself. Anyways, number 3, centrality of experiential knowledge. Whatever, this is okay, I suppose. CRT asserts that the experiential knowledge of people of color is appropriate, legitimate, and integral part to analyzing and understanding racial inequality. Number 4, the interdisciplinary perspective. CRT challenges what they essentially say, the idea that history needs to speak for itself. They want to challenge our basic notion of how we know history. Number 5 is commitment to social justice. As you've heard, CRT is a framework that is committed to a social justice agenda to eliminate all forms of subordination to any people. Okay, look, and what I'm saying, Zig, basically is that there are things within those tenets right now that need to be discussed, that should be discussed. CRT itself started as a principal within law school. Having a JD, I can speak to this notion that there were multiple times throughout American history that even within our legal code itself, it was very clearly designed to be discriminatory towards a particular race. I can clearly speak to that. And having a conversation about that is an okay thing. But once you tip that line into challenging objectivity, challenging media, challenging meritocracy, we've surpassed a actual conversation. We've certainly surpassed something nuanced that will get us to a good point of progress. Okay, now we're getting to the point of what Zig said, a pure religion that if you do not follow, you risk losing tenure. And I think that's one of the real problems of starting at such a high level of academia and just letting it trickle down into our K-12 stuff. Yeah.
Well, I think what also ought to be discussed is that this utopian notion of fairness is fundamentally unattainable, where not even in the Garden of Eden were humans equal, nor in heaven do any angels exist without distinction. I think, according to one's theology, there are a number of different angels who have different ranks. So not even in heaven does equality exist. In fact, nowhere in all of world history or myths or society has this perfect equality existed. So therefore, we can't say that it's based on historical fact that there's been a society by which we can measure all others and say that that's the society that's created perfect equality. No, that's not based on analysis of history or what's going on. In fact, only in the resentful hearts of despairing radicals does this notion of perfect equality exist. And it creates a sense of permanent anger because the utopian fairness that these people want to believe in, they only believe in that because they're so depressed about their own, sometimes occasionally sad lives. Some of these people live very sad, unmerited and undistinguished lives. So they create this fantasy utopia that they can put their heart and soul into. and worship that. But the problem is that over time, then that utopian ideal becomes the measuring stick of which society will never meet. And that only creates more anger and frustration. And so I think when we start worshiping things like equality or perfect fairness, you're going to create a religion of permanent anger. People who are permanently upset because they created an ideal that cannot exist here on earth. That's a
Yeah,
problem, right?
it's a problem. And think about it this way, Zig. So how do you account for every possible thing that could go into an equity standard? Here's what I mean. Okay. I don't Everybody in America, the American premise itself is predicated upon the idea that everyone should have equality of opportunity, okay? That everyone should be equal to the idea of what you should be able to achieve given the amount of work you put into it. Now, we could have a conversation all day long about what that meant for the Three-Fifths Compromise in the beginning of the country. Put that aside for a second. The words that were used in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence clearly set out a mechanism by which you can say, if you achieve and you strive hard enough, you should be able to accomplish something greater than those that came before you. Equality of opportunity, okay? But what we're talking about here and what equity and CRT is really pushing, what Zig just touched on, is this idea of equality of outcome. And I don't know how you account for every single variable that could possibly go into making outcome. I mean, quite frankly, the one that is probably most determinative of where you end up in your life is IQ or physical giftedness. How do you account for that? I'm not going to play in the NBA, Zig, and it's not because nobody wants to watch me play in the NBA. LeBron is playing in the NBA because he's 6'8" and 250 pounds and can dunk from the 3-throw line, right? That's why LeBron James is playing in the NBA. I'm not playing in the NBA because I'm 5'8". You get what I'm saying? So I don't know how you account for some of these things. How do you account for weight? How do you account for IQ? How do you account for height? Okay, some of these things you just can't simply account for. And even if you could, where's the inline of the variable that you don't account for anymore? Is there at some point in society where we've accounted for 55 different variables and we say, okay, now we've reached a magic number. We have actual equity. But what about that 56th one? Is that not as good as the other 55? You get what I'm saying, Zig? So
Yeah,
look,
no, I get that, and I think I think that the points that you made really highlight why this is a religious system, because there is no such thing as equality of outcome. It transcends the bounds of what is rational, according to most people. But I don't even think that it's a problem that it's a religion. Part of the problem is that it's a state mandated religion. And then also, too, just in terms of assessing whether or not this is going to lead to somebody living a happy life. And if you can choose between worshiping fairness, which undergirds CRT, or worshiping a god or many gods, people are still opting to worship a god that only causes them frustration, or a secular god that causes frustration and social discord. How in the world does that make any sense? Like, if you could choose between being frustrated all the time and believing in redemption in an afterlife, if that belief in redemption in afterlife leads to a healthier outcome for you as a person, isn't that the most crucial consideration? Like, when people are looking at the ideologies that they choose to believe, shouldn't they step back and ask, well, is this going to make me happy, healthy, and wealthy? Like,
yeah,
shouldn't
and
those
I
things be
think
asked?
I think when you look at these, say, 5 tenets of CRT, okay, if you look at one of them as being that, America, one of the central components of America is racism, and you couple that with this idea that you cannot consider objectivity or meritocracy anymore, what the natural outcome ends up being then is you get this ideology of one that says that you are a victim, you are a perpetual victim that needs to be taken care of, right? You are a liability that but for my involvement as government in your life, you just can't do it on your own. That is a very belittling and dehumanizing ideology to follow. This idea that like you are somehow hobbled by your very existence and you just can't do it, but I'll come save you. This Messiah complex that's attached to the top of this stuff is so degrading to human life. You know what I'm saying, Zig? I think what you're touching on in I'm a Christian. I don't hide that from anybody. I root this ideology in my Judeo-Christianity, but one that says like, look, I believe you are strong. I believe you are capable. I believe you can do this on your own. I personally believe that the creator of the entire universe has chosen you, and specifically you, for a task that only you are capable of accomplishing, right? And if you do actually put enough effort into that thing, you can accomplish that goal, even if it's in such a niche way that it's only you doing that thing. You know what I'm saying? So this
Yep.
is one that's of empowerment, of believability, of actually giving you something to strive for. It's as opposed to the other one that says like, well, just wait for me to come save you, and then you'll actually be able to live your life.
Right. No, and that's what people ought to consider when choosing a belief system. I mean, I think just as a general rule, people should choose things that make them happy. And if they don't know anybody who is happy, who believes a particular set of beliefs, people should step back and say, boy, I wonder if people just aren't happy because what they believe, not what reality is, or the lack of opportunity or achievement, but perhaps it's the belief in and of itself that's disenfranchising people. In fact, what's even more particularly concerning is that this belief system may even cause the kind of self-oppression that it's designed to encourage people to overcome. At least if you look at it from a sympathetic point of view. Hey, we're going to do more for minorities because things have been unfair for them. Okay, great. That's a noble idea to some degree. But if you're telling them then that they can't do anything because these invisible barriers that nobody can see, well, is that really going to lead to the outcome that you're saying that you want it to lead to? Is it really going to be able to be an instrument in helping the poor and oppressed? Probably not. And so therefore I think it should be reconceptualized, but also people who are more conservative leaning or Republican leaning should be able to speak to the fact that either their faith or their progress through capitalism has allowed them to succeed in a way that something like CRT is not allowing people to succeed. And when CRT does allow people to succeed, those people have to tell people that they're not successful.
Yeah, that's true.
Or they have to feel mandatory guilt for their success.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know why anybody would choose that.
I don't know either, but I posted this article in the Facebook chat. I'll do the same in the YouTube chat as well, so everybody can follow along. ZigmundReichenbach.com. But one of the things you say in this article, Zig, and this is the last point I'll make in this, and I'm sure we can get to another topic here in a second. But you say academics love CRT because it gives them a veneer of meaning and a sense of utility. That is absolutely dead spot on. I've been reading through a book recently by a guy named Patrick Deneen. It's called Why Liberalism Failed, and he doesn't mean liberalism as you and I might understand liberalism, say in 2022. He means in the classical sense, right? He means in like the Lacanean philosophy sense. He means in the founding fathers sense. He means it in like self-governance, self-rule, limited government sense. And what he says is if conservatives, if modern day conservatives want to take over academia, or at least take academia back from some of this type of ideology, he says you focus first on the humanities, which is a very interesting concept for me to consider. I thought that's nonsense. What are you talking about? That's lost. Let it go. But what he means is he goes through this entire presentation essentially saying that as the humanities ended up offering less and less for the people that actually needed to get legitimate degrees, the humanities ended up changing their terminology to the way the sciences present things. Because the sciences were running everything. STEM is what you go to college for to get an actual degree, to have an actual job. Whereas the humanities were meant to train virtue and value and teach you how to be an actual human being to pour back into society. And as conservatives or conservatism, whatever you want to say, left that realm, the humanities had to make up an entirely new language to do just what Zig said, to give them a sense and a veneer of meaning and a sense of utility, right? And this guy, Patrick Deneen, does this beautiful explanation on how it became this self sort of fulfilling prophecy. This thing that just sort of like perpetuated onto itself, where like the more you got into it to just maintain a job, just to give yourself a reason to come back and have a job the next day, by creating this new terminology that everybody had to live up to. You had to publish more papers by buying into that terminology. You had to get tenure because of some type of diversity standard, which is what universities are doing now. You had to do more and more and more to reach the level of some type of veneer or sense of utility as the sciences did. You've now created this entire thing where you've created your own worth. right? And now because CRTs become a real problem because there's like an actual scientific standard that you have to meet that nobody can actually really meet. Because as you said, Zig, nobody's really perfect. Nobody can ever meet that standard.
Yeah, well, and it's problematic because if you ask those people to volunteer at an after school program to help to help kids from low income families, those academics will not do that. And I know because I've done that before. Shout out to Lycoming College. Thanks a lot, academics, for not helping people in the after school program. Bravo. Cheers for you guys on that. But instead of doing that, they insist that people profess their guilt in a very religious way, such that if you wanted to get promoted and you're not willing to kneel at the altar of CRT and confess your privilege, you may not get that. Or the only way you would be able to get that is if you're like Victor Davis Hanson, who has published so many books and spends so much time doing other things that they can't dispense of him just because he's so distinguished. But there are other lesser scholars who in some cases would be more capable than some of the professors that exist now, but because they refuse to confess for something that they probably didn't do, then they're denied tenure or they're even denied the opportunity to enter. Right along those lines, I would be interested in becoming an academic, and that's part of the reason why I started this podcast and why I started writing articles, because it's just not possible for somebody like me to be able to get in because I don't have anything that I'm going to confess for. I don't feel guilty about anything. I don't feel any sense of shame, and I'm not going to shame myself or shame other people and say this and that. I think all people should be left alone, but it keeps academically minded people out. And so if anyone that's listening is in that vein, just realize you may have to start your own podcast or start your own writing just because you'll never be allowed in there. And that's what you should be encouraged to do, to create new media and to bear new fruits, in lieu of the fact that the old media and the old corporate system with universities and public schools, that's never going to work for us. And it's time
Yeah.
to move on and set up a parallel society where we can thrive on our own and not depend on corporate media.
Let me tell a quick story that I think would be a perfect segue into this next story, Zig, assessing political candidates' use of unhelpful political terminology. I went to go have lunch, or rather dinner, with a couple, both of which are professors at, I'm not going to say their name or even what university they're at, but suffice to say it's a very well-known, prominent Division I university somewhere in the South. All right. And this guy ends up telling me this story that one of the things they do as in, this sort of like, I don't know, welcoming class or whatever, the word escapes me now, but what you do when you come in as a professor and say, hey, here's your inauguration type thing. Here's the classes we're going to go to get to know each other and what it means to be a university professor. One of the books they have you read through and then discuss amongst the other incoming professors is a book that I don't remember the name of it, but it's some guy that apparently went throughout the South to try and diagnose the psychosis of Trump supporters and Trump voters. Now, say what you will about President Trump. That's not the point of my story. You can love Trump or hate Trump, okay? But to have an incoming class of professors at a Division I university to go through and diagnose the book that says, like, why are we experiencing such psychosis for people that would vote for a guy like Donald Trump? I mean, that kind of speaks to what you're talking about, Zig, that, like, God forbid you have an alternate opinion. You certainly can't express it within academia. That much we know is for sure, right? And it kind of goes to this notion, too, that as academia goes, so goes media. And so goes media, so goes the politicians themselves. Because as you say in this article here, man, some of these unhelpful terms that politicians are using or even media are using about politicians is meant to, like, create this haze, this sort of gloss that you can't see through. It means something, but it doesn't really mean that. It's like double speak type stuff. It's an interesting article,
No, that's right. Well, and I should have just entitled it "Political Cliches" because what I sent it out has people didn't click it. I think in part because the stupid way that I worded it, which indicates that stupidity can really circulate to anybody through anybody. I could have made a much more marketable term with some of the political cliches that people use. And you're right, it makes it difficult for ordinary people to screen or vet candidates because a lot of people don't know any better. And hopefully by identifying some of these cliches that are used, maybe we can do away from some of this needless jargon. I'll just start with one of the six here is the idea of an ambitious politician. I think the days of wanting ambitious politicians should be over. I don't think that we've ever suffered in the United States from a lack of ambitious politicians. I don't think that that's happened at all. And if you think otherwise, I'd be interested in having you on my show. But I think these politicians have been plenty ambitious, and we've seen that in the outgrowth of the entitlement state, the domination of the federal government, and the tyranny that's imposed onto these individual states. We've already seen that, and so it shouldn't be that shouldn't be a term used to laud candidates, and candidates themselves shouldn't be saying, well, I'm so ambitious, I'm going to get this done, I'm going to get that done. Why? I'd like it if you weren't ambitious. I would like it, or perhaps perhaps instead of ambitious, maybe diligent and telling people why they're wrong. We don't need any more government ambition. We need politicians that are going to say, listen, you guys want to implement this program and it's wrong because it calls for more government. This is not good. Or signing some kind of legislation that tells the administrative state, hey, you guys can back off. Or if you're going to do anything in the administrative state, instead of us just rejecting that legislation through the Congressional Review Act, we have to explicitly vote on that and support that. And that's really what we should move towards, and kind of move away from this term like ambitious, right?
Yeah. So in that article, you say the term ambitious. You're exactly right. Maybe we should start replacing the term ambitious with, say, like humility or something. Okay. So let's go back to the very first article that we discussed. That very first article was based upon the notion that in a representative republic, our representatives are up there to do just that. Represent me, not your ambitions. It has nothing to do with your ambitions, okay? You're up there because I put you up there. You are my employee. That's the way that it should be looked at. So while you're up there, it's not about your ambitions. And this is not, again, Zig, you're hitting so many stuff directly on the head here, man. It's not just like we're throwing these terms out there because it's fun to talk about in a philosophical sense. I mean, I can tell you, I'm a registered lobbyist in Tennessee here, right? I can tell you the number of people, even in the Tennessee state legislature, that you go up there and oh, okay, that guy's playing the leadership game. He's up there so that he can get to a chairmanship, so that he can get to the caucus chair, so that he can become the Speaker of the House. And it has very little to do with the people that he's representing. It has much more to do with his ambitions and his desire to move up like he would in any other corporate ladder or chain. And again, Zig, here's the point. If you want to go work for AT&T and climb that Forbes 500 corporate ladder, have at it, buddy. By all means, please go do that. Please, all right, make your society better by doing that. But if you're going to go be ambitious on my dollar, on my dime, to not represent my best interest, but your best interest, that is not the scheme or the plan or the design of a representative republic. That's what it's really about. That's why I say you're right. Replace with humility.
Let's take a concrete example of how ambition has replaced humility, where it seems like part of Biden's Build Back Better plan was designed to give funds to the Department of Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, so that way he can be the one to administer those funds and claim success for that, which has a twofold appeal. One is that it's going to appeal to the left-wing corporate donors who say, oh, wow, this guy knows how to distribute grant monies to our causes. We got to vote for this guy. This guy's progressive. He's radical. He's a real hero for sending out this money. And likewise, ordinary citizens are going to be duped into thinking that just because somebody administered a record-breaking level of funds that they may be competent. Well, no, just because you have a vast bureaucracy, that doesn't mean that you're competent. That doesn't mean that because you give out money, you're and moreover, there's no way to make that assessment anyhow. I would say that the man's competent in administering funds if we had some measure of determining how many of those dollars went to fraudulent causes and how many of those went to real causes. And he said, well, all of these went to legitimate causes with no fraud, but I guarantee you that's probably not going to happen. There'll probably be some fraud, as there typically is in any big government program. But that's a clear-cut example of how the ambitions, they're all touting Pete Buttigieg as a great ambitious person. Uh, that should be that idea should be replaced by something like humility. And it
Yeah.
kind of ties into this next idea, because you have another tact of how people try to win these elections to further their ambitions by claiming that they're an outsider. Well, all that means is that you're somebody who wants to win an election but hasn't been able to.
I
Right?
think that's my favorite thing I've ever seen you write, Zig, is that one statement. An outsider is someone who wants to win an election but hasn't yet. That's great.
I mean, and that's not a noble thing. In fact, whether or not somebody is an outsider or an outcast, that's a different thing. Probably a lot of these people that are claiming to be outsiders are actually outcast. And you don't go around waving this big badge or a flag saying, "Hey, I'm a great outcast. Nobody likes me. I'm not able to negotiate with anybody because I voluntarily chose to be an outcast." It's not a great thing. And it's such a desperate term that candidates often rely on this because they want to compare themselves, which makes zero sense, to former President Trump, who many considered was an ultimate outsider. Well, no, Trump was not an outsider. You can't do real estate in the state of New York with being an outsider. But the same people that are claiming to be outsiders forget that, yes, Trump was an outsider, but unlike Trump, they don't have $1 billion. And saying that they're an outsider doesn't help them overcome the fact that they don't have $1 billion. Likewise, lawyers can't be outsiders either, right? Lawyers are, and I've heard some lawyers while campaigning. I almost slipped into using one of those stupid terms that I listed here in campaign trail. But I heard a lawyer imply that they're an outsider. Well, you can't be an outsider if, yes, you're not writing the law, but you're dealing with the law. And other people who deal with the law, because by definition, that's what you do as a lawyer. In fact, in many cases, you're connected at the hip to politicians. There's nobody who could be further from an outsider than lawyers. And so any diligent member of the public ought to say, well, if these guys are throwing things out like this, maybe they don't know what they're talking about, right?
Yeah, let's go back to the comment Todd made earlier from the beginning of the show when we were talking about the 17th Amendment. All right. Again, this idea of the 17th Amendment made it so that you don't have the state legislatures electing our federal senators. Okay. And Todd said, while not an original consideration, as far as I know, prior to the 17th Amendment, willful denial by the states to send senators, thereby denying a quorum, could serve as a powerful check on too much power being assumed by the central government, which is a fantastic point. Okay. So all along the process, there was these little stall, little check, little balance, little check, little balance. And to Zig's points here about calling yourself an outsider, I mean, I don't know, Zig, maybe call yourself a statesman. Maybe that's not even good enough. But the point is, right, by calling yourself an outsider, you're almost doing yourself a disservice by saying, well, I don't know how this game operates over here, but I'm going to go in there and fix it up. Well, come on, man. You have to have at least some tacit knowledge of what's happening here in our 240 plus year history, wherever we're at right now, to go in there and understand if you need to clean something up or fix it, understand what we came from. Just calling yourself an outsider is not going to be enough. Okay. You have to be able to point towards some type of comprehensive North Star that we're all in agreement that we would like to move towards. Because this whole notion of the grass is greener is not necessarily always true. Just getting an outsider in there to change something and wreck shop like a bull in a china shop is not in and of itself going to give us a better outcome. It'll give us something different, but different is not always necessarily better.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, it's just not the case that the outsiders are by definition good. In fact, if you were running a business, you wouldn't hire an outsider who's in a different industry to come into your business. I guess sometimes, see, perhaps that's a metaphor that's a little more apt in the business realm, but in terms of the actual craft of politics, it doesn't work like that. Like, maybe you could, if you have a CEO of one company and they come in from a different industry, and in that sense they're an outsider because they're from a different industry, yeah, perhaps that could work and could apply. But if you have somebody who's saying that they're an outsider when they don't know what they're doing, that's not that great. Just like using the terms tax credit or tax break. You have people who claim to be pro-business Republicans to advocate for these deals when it really just turns out to be a special handouts for their friends, allies, or donors. And moreover, the notion of tax credits or tax breaks are politicians love, because it's a giveaway that they can kind of use to pat the public on the head while really rewarding their shadow patrons. And it allows them to provide a simple solution to a very complex problem where the economy isn't something that, oh well, it failed because we only gave out uh, 10 out of 30 tax breaks or tax credits. If we just give 12.5 tax breaks it's not like that. It's not like there's a magic number of tax credits or tax break funds that can fix the economy. There's so much going on that that level of unsophisticated analysis should be rejected by any voter. If any voter hears somebody talk about tax or candidate talk about tax credit or tax break, that should be an automatic demerit in their mind. Just fundamentally so, because that means that politicians are just looking to appease you by buying your loyalty with a seemingly good thing, right?
Yeah. So last year in Tennessee, not even last year, just like 3 months ago, even it was this October, I think, we had a special session in Tennessee specifically called so that the Tennessee state legislature could allocate what amounted to be about $850 million to Ford to bring them into our state to start, I don't know, man, manufacturing batteries or something dumb. I don't know what they're doing. It's something for the new Ford truck that they're producing. It doesn't matter. And we went up there to just basically discuss the idea of like whether or not a Republican supermajority should start supporting the idea of corporate welfare. And Zeke, I kid you not, there was about 45 different definitions of what that term meant. Nobody had a consistent definition of what corporate welfare was, right? Like every Republican, well, this isn't corporate welfare. Corporate welfare is when you give state dollars to prop up a dying business. This is just the way business is done, boy. I had another politician tell me that corporate welfare is basically just when you give Republican controlled money to basically a Democrat company. And I was like, what is a Democrat company? You know what I mean? But here's my point. If you really did want to do an actual tax break or a tax credit, there are ways to do that. Okay. Look at these Tabor bills that they passed out in maybe Colorado or something, where it kind of says that the state legislature can garner funds up to a certain point of revenue. So you can basically take taxes up to a certain point. Let's call it $1 billion, although it's way more than that. But just for the sake of the argument, say you can get up to $1 billion. Anything over $1 billion, you have to give back to the populace by way of an actual tax credit or tax break because it was their money to begin with. So there are actual ways you could do this if you really did, as a politician, want to support a tax credit or tax break. Give it back to the people it came from, right?
Even
or just
then,
don't
Grant,
take it to begin with. Maybe
you're kind of getting into this political game of changing what the meanings of words mean. So yes, what you're saying, taxpayer, the taxpayer bill of rights in Colorado, yes, it would in effect create a tax break of sorts, but that's not what people mean when they say that. What they really mean is we're going to target a specific handful of businesses and give them leeway to where they don't have to pay taxes. Yes, something like Tabor is kind of like that, but Tabor does that by controlling spending. Well, Tabor is different. It does a ton of things. It limits spending so that there's less taxes. And then also anytime there's a tax increase, the citizens of Colorado have to vote on that. But politicians would be prohibited, mentally prohibited from thinking about those things thoughtfully because they rely on these outdated terms like tax credit or tax break that stops them from finding an adequate solution. And I guess just for the sake of time here, we'll just move on to this before we get into the big vax mandate win that was not indeed, at least in my mind, a win. So getting things done, we have politicians say, oh, I'm gonna get her done. I'm gonna get in there and I'm gonna change the system. We're gonna just do this and that, and we're just gonna revamp the economy and everybody's going to be happy. And I know how to do it. I can't tell you or articulate how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to get in there and we're going to get it done. Well, no. Again, we don't want anybody to be getting things done. At least we, we want to make sure first, before people are doing things, that they're doing the right things or doing things the right way. What I said here in the article is that this get or done mentality is actually because people just want to do things without having any regard of whether or not it's right. It's actually resulted in the highest incarceration rate of former politicians. Okay, that's the get it done mentality, by any means necessary mentality. We're gonna get it done. Well, in Pennsylvania, that means incarceration, and I don't think that that's particularly admirable. So that's what we have in that. And but the story of the day, I guess, or apparently the story of the week, was the big vaccine mandate. The Supreme Court last week overturned at least part of one of Biden's mandates, which was the OSHA mandate requiring employers of over 50 or more people to mandate that people get the vaccine lest they be terminated. Well, yes, while it is great that the Supreme Court overturned that, it has a blatant rule of totalitarianism. What they never asked first was whether or not OSHA even has the power to make any rules like that to start with. This would have been a perfect opportunity to revisit what's called Chevron deference, which states that any ambiguously written thing, rule by an agency like OSHA, that those agencies have the right to interpret that ambiguity as they want. And so that's what's given these administrative agencies the power to even make those vaccine mandates to start with. Well, if we've overturned one mandate, but we haven't limited the power of these agencies in any meaningful way, what's to stop them from doing it in the future? In fact, because there's so much government control of healthcare through Medicare and Medicaid, the Supreme Court actually said, well, the government can mandate that workers in any hospital that receives Medicare or Medicaid, which is almost every hospital for all practical purposes, except for ones that are either privately run or probably Christian hospitals, which are few, and that number is declining, that those people still have to get the vaccine. Well, how is that a win? Why haven't we been able to discuss whether or not these places have the authority to accomplish any mandate at all? Because I don't see any piece of legislation that says that Congress has handed over power to OSHA. Like, there's no legislation that unequivocally and clearly states that. It does not exist. And meanwhile, the Senate, if they want to message something, they don't have a problem doing that. They can create bills that say end Asian hate. So they can message clearly if they choose to do so. They can speak clearly if they choose to do so, but they never did that with any of these administrative agencies. And I think anybody who's observing what's going on in politics, they shouldn't be cheering this. They should be wondering why, or wondering why the Supreme Court lacked the courage to go far enough, right?
Yeah, and this is a topic that has been kicked back and forth since literally the founding of the country. This topic in particular being Congress's ability to delegate some of its authority. That's what this really comes down to. And that's what I liked about the piece that you wrote today. Because Republicans want to tout this as a win for the time being, and I guess on its face it might have been if you just look at the immediate application. So the question that the Supreme Court was asking, or the issue rather, as they call it, was specifically based upon, there's two different things, but it's specifically based upon whether or not OSHA could continue forcing companies to do something while these other courts underneath the Supreme Court were still playing out the actual legal argument. That was the only issue that was being considered at the time, okay? Whether OSHA could keep doing what it was doing until these other courts figured something out. So hopefully, fingers crossed, the real issue at hand will come back to the Supreme Court, although I'm not going to hold my breath here. But that real issue at hand, specifically being whether or not Congress could delegate its authority. That's what they left it up to. At the end of it, they basically said, like, well, Congress hasn't yet delegated the authority for OSHA to just force you to shove something in your body at any given time, whether they call it a pandemic. But they could. And if they do so later on, maybe we'll bring that up when it gets to it. And this idea that, sometimes Congress can delegate its authority, sometimes it can't. Like go all the way back to like the 1800s, a case called United States versus Shreveport Grain. At that point, it was discussed that the legislative power of Congress cannot be delegated. And on other occasions, it's more recognized forthrightly, such as, like, say, Justice Marshall Justice Marshall in 1825 said that, you can delegate some authorities at a particular time, but you can't delegate legislative authorities. Going back to, say, pull up to 1935, the court struck down a delegation to administrative agency, and the court basically proved at that point that without deviation, Congress's ability to delegate power has broad authority and broad standards. So we've gone back and forth from this thing of to what extent Congress can basically say, hey, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I'm going to give it off to this agency to do it for me. Here's the problem, okay? Where we're sitting right now is still a court match back and forth. Where we're sitting right now on Congress's ability to delegate its authority and what part of its authority it can delegate is something we're still kicking back and forth. But the biggest component of all of this, again, goes to the underlying theme of today's show. These agencies are unelected individuals. They are accountable to nobody and nothing except itself. All these alphabet agencies, whether it's the FDA or the ATF or I don't know, man, fill in your alphabet agency. It doesn't matter. They are not elected individuals, and they are certainly not accountable to the people themselves. Now, Supreme Court has said that because we have 30 million people right now, because we're such a bloated bureaucracy, the simple mechanics of what Congress needs to do to make daily life work just can't be done unless you delegate some of that to an agency. So that's where their part is coming from. Where my part is coming from, okay, fine. But the more you tip over into unelected agencies doing this that are not accountable to the people, the more we have a fourth branch of government that's actually running my daily life through rules and regulations, okay? So there might not be they may not be legislating, they may not be passing law, but every time they pass a regulation that I have to follow, it's the same daily effect on my life as if Congress were to pass a law, right? So now we've circumvented Congress yet one more time. We did it through the court system. We did it through the 17th Amendment, right? We did it through the Congress, through courts actually just telling us that they're going to rule on something. Now we're doing it through the administrative agency, through these rules and regulations, and it's getting us further and further away from the actual design of the country when we began,
Yeah, that's right. And where the Supreme Court has stood, or what seems to be happening, is sometimes if you have a conservative majority or a conservative judge, they will only agree to partially limit these agencies' powers through what's called the major rules doctrine. Now, how courts work is they rely on certain doctrines or tests, and they try to apply the law to those tests in order to determine whether or not something can or can't happen. And after a period of time, after so many rulings, you can make an inference about whether or not a particular doctrine exists. So after so many cases, you can say, well, we've seen has a pattern this major rule doctrine emerge, and typically that kind of thing is done through these various law reviews that will consider those questions and ideas. But what the Supreme Court here has done is they've brought out this idea called the major rules doctrine, which states that agencies can't pass regulations of vast economic or political significance, given that important choices of social policy are and must be made by Congress. Well, that's a nice enough rule, okay? But when you only bring that rule out occasionally, and you kind of waver in how you interpret or use that rule, then you really haven't done anything to stop the core cause of the problem, which is these agencies even thinking that they have the slightest chance of ever being able to do anything like this again. And to just throw out this wishy-washy doctrine when in a similar case for places that receive Medicare and Medicaid for medical workers, you haven't said, well, the major rules doctrine applies here, is bogus. That's not a win. And anybody who's telling you that that's a win only does so because they want to pat themselves in the back for thinking the right thoughts. I thought this all along. I thought this was going to be overturned. Isn't this great? Well, that's a little vain, and that's a little self-serving in a way that's really not helping the public in any meaningful way. The public needs to understand that agencies should never have the power to attempt anything like this ever at all.
Yeah,
Anytime.
and there are ways I believe that people can start fighting back against this general idea of this overwhelming federal bureaucracy. Again, whether it's through our own Congress, Supreme Court, whether it's through executive orders, or now that we have to deal with another agency itself, this fourth branch of government pushing stuff down on us. There's a bill actually that I'm carrying in, I'm not carrying it, that I'm lobbying in Tennessee. It's called the Federal Nullification Bill. Now, typically these bills do very poorly when it comes to federal courts actually deciding upon these, but the basic notion says this, that if there's any federal action at all, whether it's, I don't know, an agency rule or regulation, whether it's something passed by Congress, whether it's an executive order, the Tennessee state legislature will have the right to convene a body together and actually determine the constitutionality of that rule, right? Whether it violates Tennessee state constitution or in their own assessment, the United States Constitution. And if they do determine that it violates the United States Constitution, that ruling by this new committee in Tennessee will then actually be enacted into a piece of legislation, a new bill that says, hey, such and such is deemed unconstitutional. We refuse to follow it. Okay. And then that actually goes to the governor to sign. Now, inevitably, that will create yet another court thing, another ruling or another case that has to be decided by some court system somewhere, but it's at least something that we can put out there to say, look, it's become too much. We're doing too much at the federal level. And Zig, it's starting to get to the point, Mayor, where I think people are going to start saying that the emperor has no clothes, right? There are too many books from too many good qualified men that I've read recently that have said this exact thing, that the federal government is squeezing too much power. There's too much of a consolidation of government to power into the top rule down. And it just doesn't make sense to anyone anymore. It's not even that it was just a complete divergence from how we began, right? It's the bigger idea that, like, I don't know these people in DC. I can't touch these people. I can't meet with these people. Very rarely. I've met a few of my federal politicians, and I work in politics. I've only met them on a few occasions, and it's because I'm at the position of my career that I am. So goodness gracious, some person who works a day job out there, I don't know, man, a doctor or even an attorney, or let's say you work, I don't know, as a mechanic or something, your ability to meet your actual congressman is far and few between. Now, you could try and set that up, but the point I'm making, Zig, is you can't touch these people. They don't know what's going on back down here. So if they're running daily life for you, the ability to have that disconnect, right? They're just not going to be able to understand. And you start to lose a sense of comprehension and language even. We lose common reference points with each other. I'm saying something that doesn't make sense to a DC politician, and they're saying something that doesn't make sense to me in my daily life. So pulling that back down to a more centralized focus and something that's actually living beside me, I think that's the solution. I really do. And I hope, fingers crossed, that we can actually start getting back to that. Because the other option, Zig, the other option is something that I don't want to consider. You know what I mean?
And we can talk about that and another show, the notion of something like a national divorce or something in that nature. We can certainly talk about that. I think some of those things are perhaps overblown, and I think sometimes ideas like that are talked about so they can attract people's attention without having to actually provide some kind of thoughtful analysis of the situation. More often than not, it's how those stories function. Well, that's all we have for today's show. We've covered a lot. Make sure to visit ZigmundDReichenbach.com to keep up to date with all the articles about politics and policy and philosophy that others aren't talking about, and for a more thoughtful analysis of what's going on than what you get elsewhere. And if you want to support and you want to make sure that we're able to reach more people, go to patreon.com/Sigmund E. Reichenbach and go ahead and click that donation. So that way we can either run ads or we can cover the cost of operation just for somebody to get involved in a small time podcast or small time show like this. Cost on average approximately $60 per month. So any contribution you can make so that way we can keep the lights on and keep this show on the road would be awesome. Well, that's all we have. And in the meantime, we will see y'all next week, maybe with Grant, maybe with Christian Watson, who couldn't make it because of a power outage, I guess, down there in Georgia. So we'll most definitely see y'all next week.